morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone, and welcome to Global Insights, a live interactive weekly panel discussion which sheds light on big questions currently facing researchers, planners, and policymakers worldwide. Global Insights features experts from leading institutions in the study of international affairs, including the Balsillie School of International Affairs in Canada, the American University in Washington, D.C., the Institute for Strategic Affairs in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the University of Constance in Germany, and the University of Warwick in the UK. Today's live stream session is entitled COVID-19 and the Impact on Climate Change and Energy Structures. My name is Anne Fitzgerald. I'm the director of the Balsillie School, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's session. A warm welcome to all of you in the audience, and there's many of you today. We would ask that you direct any questions to the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom panel, and we will do our best to channel them to the appropriate panelist, particularly at the end of the session. We're privileged today to host 5 well-known experts on issues relating to climate change and energy. Professor Simon Dalby is a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada and a faculty member at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. He is co-editor of Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, a Routledge 2019 publication, and the author of Anthropocene Geopolitics 2020. Selam Kidane Abebe is the legal advisor to the African Group of Negotiators under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. She is currently the Leverhulme Trust Doctoral Candidate on the subject of climate justice at the University of Reading. Prior to this, she led the policy and legal department of the Ministry of Environment, Climate Change and Forests in Ethiopia. Caroline Kuzemko is an associate professor at the University of Warwick's Politics and International Studies Department. She is also the deputy leader of the UK Energy Research Centre's programme on UK energy in a global context, and she is widely published on the political economy of sustainable energy transitions. Malini Ranganathan is associate professor at the School of International Service at American University in Washington, D.C. Her research focuses on environmental and climate justice and the political economy of urban infrastructure and housing in both India and the United States. Jatin Nathwani is a professor and the inaugural Ontario Research Chair in Public Policy for Sustainable Energy. He is the executive director of the Waterloo Institute of Sustainable Energy at the University of Waterloo. Thank you very much to all panelists. A warm welcome to all of you today. I'd like to kick off right away with a question for Professor Simon Dalby, please. Simon, how does the COVID crisis intersect with climate change, certainly in the short to medium term?
In many ways, they are part and parcel of symptoms of our rapidly changing world and our rapidly interconnected world. Globalization has linked us together, so problems with one part of the world, parts of, in this case, of an outbreak in China quickly went global. Likewise, in terms of climate change, a bit of combustion in one place can lead to weather events in other parts of the world. We live in this interconnected world. In another crucial way, of course, the interconnections are in many places we have failed to do the appropriate preparation. It was quite clear that pandemics were going to happen, but in the last few years, in many crucial parts of the world, the pandemic preparations have simply been cancelled. We know the increasing severity of extreme events, in particular, coming from climate change. And once again, we have been, in many parts of the world, slow to respond to an obvious danger that is emerging. So those two angles give us sort of the context within which we are now facing multiple crises. And hopefully we can learn our lessons fairly quickly from one to apply to the other, because clearly detailed responses are going to be needed in place-specific responses to both in coming years.
Malini, is this a double crisis, as many activists are suggesting?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. It's great to be here. When activists report on this supposed double crisis, they're alluding to the fact that people don't experience one threat at a time, but experience threats simultaneously and multiply. That is, they experience them intersectionally because of the layered and mutually reinforcing ways that structural discrimination works. Double crisis here refers to both COVID and climate change. Indeed, some others have spoken about a triple crisis, that is COVID, climate change, and gaping inequality. It is now a well-known fact, though it took some time for the data to come to light, and there's more data that needs collecting, that the racial geographies of the pandemic overlay alarmingly well on the racial geographies of environmental and climate harm in America. Take Chicago, for instance, where African Americans make up just 30% of the population, but they account for half of its 1,000 coronavirus deaths to date. If you look at the geography of the city, the Southwest concentrates these deaths, but it also concentrates coal plants and steel smelters, and therefore has the highest rates of asthma and lung disease, which we all know are very bad for COVID-19. This is also an area that happens to comprise the same neighborhoods that Eric Klinenberg found in his 1995 book, Heat Wave, A Social Autopsy of Disaster in Chicago, to suffer disproportionately from extreme heat-related deaths. We know that summer fires, heat waves, hurricanes, and monsoons are coming this summer and this fall. So what happens when agencies are tasked with both coronavirus and similar pandemics and climate distress at the same time? This is what is meant by a double or even triple crisis.
Thank you very much. Caroline, does COVID-19 provide a test of commitment for sustainable change?
I would say it does. It's a crucial test, but it's also a very politically interesting test. So if we were listening to what Simon and Malini were already talking about, this is a very specific moment in time that we now sit in. So clearly in the near term, global, national and local governments will be fully focused on how best to respond to, how best to manage this global pandemic. But then in the medium term, they will need to consider how to recover from it. And one of the key tests here is whether policymakers feel that there are opportunities to incorporate sustainability into how they design recovery and stimulus packages, and actually also whether they can maintain climate change mitigation programs already in place. So this is a key test moment. So obviously, in many cases for many governments at many scales, global, national, local, this is very challenging. Governments, businesses, households, we're all under great pressure right now. But by the same token, I think that there's a strong case to be made for a green recovery this time around, partly because climate change is more established politically than it ever has been before. And also from what I look at, which is sustainable energy transitions, they are more embedded than they have been at previous moments in time. So crucial test, but a very interesting one.
Thank you. Jatin Nathwani, what are your thoughts on how these two crises intersect?
I have often argued that a climate threat at its core is not really a problem of the environment, but it is an energy technology transformation challenge. COVID-19 has really brought to the fore a massive commitment by the various governments around the world for financial stimulus to address the challenge both from the health and of course the economic aspects of what this imposes. But I think if there is any time, this is the time to bring some real clear thinking. I'm thinking of the medium term as to how we can focus this fiscal capacity towards a transition to a low carbon energy future. I think the choice is fairly clear. You know, one can continue to bail out the fossil sector or use this as an opportunity to really begin to redirect capital that will make very substantive difference in terms of getting to a low carbon energy future. So in my view, this is a historic opportunity, a time to bring some real clear thinking and literally change the narrative of the climate issue with respect to its energy future.
Well, you raise a good point, and I think it might be useful, especially for our participants, to go back pre-COVID. How much progress did we achieve on this agenda prior to the outbreak of the pandemic? Caroline, can I ask you first?
Well, I would focus on sustainable energy transition. So that's sort of the sector that I research. And this is interesting because energy was the highest emitter by quite a long way. But by the same token, that's the sector, therefore, that we've seen the most progress in terms of active, sustainable policy making. And so far, policies, I think, as Jatin has already referred to, have been less successful in phasing out fossil fuels, but they've been more successful in supporting clean energy, and there they have engendered some changes. So examples of that are the growth in renewables, the rapid falls in clean technology costs, including increasingly storage, which is important, but also improvements in some parts of the world in energy efficiency. And energy efficiency is an interesting one right now because there are positive co-benefits between improved efficiency and health and poverty reduction. So it's a bit of a catch-all at the moment, energy efficiency. But what that progress means is that we now understand more about renewables and energy efficiency, including some interesting things like investment in these sectors has got very good jobs and economic multipliers. So what that means for every unit of currency invested, you get quite a strong return in terms of jobs and growth. And that kind of new evidence as a result of progress in energy transitions means that there's more evidence now that we can consider when thinking about how to recover economically from the crisis, green or not, basically.
Thank you. Selam Abebe, what was the state of the multilateral negotiations before COVID? You've been very involved in this process.
Question. Yeah, as you rightly said, the multilateral process has informed one of the things that Carolina just mentioned, the revolution of the green technologies. But this process got to this point after 25 years. The UNFCCC, the convention itself, the first international treaty was agreed in 25 years ago. And throughout these years, there was a process of developing additional implementing instruments, the Kyoto Protocol, and also most recently, the Paris Agreement, which was adopted in 2015. And the understanding was Paris Agreement is based on the current science, and also it supports countries in meeting ambitious contributions. They can nationally define, they can identify the sector, but also encourage them to submit ambitious contribution to address climate change. So one can say that the international process have informed national processes, but also some have argued that over the last 25 years, the impact has not been significant, specifically referring to the UNFCCC report itself, which says large emitters, in particular developed countries, over the last 25 years have only reduced 2%. So that debate is still there, but the multilateral process has also informed national processes of governments, frameworks on climate change, the creation of resources, the collaboration between academia and so on. So that process is also as a response of the multilateral process. But one key thing is maybe the political consideration of this negotiation. When we talk about the multilateral process on negotiating and agreeing on a treaty under the climate change framework, politics has a role because that is directly linked with economy, and economy of countries is affected by their commitments and obligation. Therefore, we have currently seen the withdrawal of the US from the Paris Agreement. So these are also one of the key things to consider, yeah.
Thank you very much. Jatin, why haven't we made much progress on this agenda?
Let me help shape the scale of the challenge here. In 1990, the global primary fossil supply, the share of fossil energy in the global primary energy supply was 85% and 15% something else. 2020, you've got 85-15. So it, in one sense, is a disheartening story that I don't know, 26 COP meetings and 5 IPCC reports and a complete clarity on the question of the threat of climate change. And yet the needle has not been moved one bit. It's a little bit disheartening, but that really is the fact of the matter. And I have some thoughts on what we might do and how we can actually move the needle. But that's my answer. The progress has been rather limited, and I don't want to criticize anyone, but that is the fact.
Simon Dalby, what does this mean for the Green New Deal?
The whole Green New Deal discussion is very timely, given the fact that stimulus packages are the thing that everybody seems to think that economies have to have now to get through the COVID crisis. And to Caroline's point a moment ago, what's crucial about this is that the renewable energy sector in particular seems to have very good economic consequences in terms of multiplier effects. So if you want to get the biggest bang for your buck, if you'll forgive that awful old phrase, actually putting money into that sector, it probably flow through the economy better than most other sectors. So there's actually now a real impetus to spend money, but there's also a good economic case to spend it on rapidly ramping up renewable energy sector, simply because you get more flow through through the rest of the economy. And I think that this is a very timely moment. It's great that the Green New Deal discussion was sort of looming, because now is actually the time to act on it, precisely because it begins to move the needle. Simultaneously, to Jatin's point a few minutes ago, one of the things that's been very notable in the last few months is that the renewable energy sector has held up very well as energy demand has been reduced dramatically in the last little while. There's a terribly simple physics to this. The renewable energy doesn't involve burning things. It doesn't require actually you to pay for fuel. Once you've got the capital infrastructure up and running, it runs. And you can actually save money by simply closing down coal and gas plants, because you're not actually paying for fuel, but the renewables continue to run. So we're beginning to look at a very different kind of energy system, all of which can be encouraged at the moment, given the collapse in demand for fossil fuels in at least some parts of the economy. There's a very good case for simply writing some of those corporations off. I mean, they're just not profitable. Don't bail them out. Put the money into retooling our economy to deal with the new renewable energy. And then we can begin to up the 15 to 16, 17, 18 and drop the 85 to 84 and 80 and begin to move the needle, to use Jatin's phrase. And I think this is really the crucial opportunity. It's also a moment at which retooling, reskilling, working on getting employment for people across the economy is a crucial moment, because that's part of what the stimulus package needs to do. And of course, lots of renewable technologies require jobs in numerous different places, so you can spread the benefits across economies if you invest wisely in this. So for all these reasons, now is the moment to work hard on the transition by making sure that the money goes to the renewable sector right across the board.
Thank you very much. Malini, I'd like to come to you now in Washington. In light of these developments that the two last panelists were talking about, what does this mean for the relationship between health justice and climate/energy or climate/environment justice?
Thank you. Yes, such an excellent and important question. I've always thought that there really is no environmental justice without health justice. The two terms are really closely related. And let me just explain how they're related and how they convey similar ideas. In the COVID discourse, we've heard a lot about this term comorbidities, also referred to sometimes as underlying conditions or pre-existing conditions. And I'm sure some of you who have applied for health insurance would have seen these terms. These are medical terms. They're also used by the insurance industry. And they suggest that those with chronic underlying health issues such as asthma or hypertension or a sensitive immune system are likely to be at greater risk for runaway COVID symptoms. But this grammar tends to put the gaze on the body and on the individual. So the terms health justice and environmental justice broadens these more medicalized individualistic terms to really put our gaze not just on the biological factors, but also the social, economic, and political structures that predispose particular groups to negative health outcomes and environmental discrimination. So as I've discussed in my writing, this is very closely related to the term climate justice, which recognizes that it's not just biophysical factors alone that account for climate-induced damage, but the unequal social and political economic structures that are worsening climate change vulnerability for certain groups. And so both the terms health justice and climate justice aim to shift our gaze from factors like biology or the sky to the political, economic, and the embedded systems and hierarchies pertaining to race, class, gender, and ethnicity that we should focus on addressing.
Thank you very much. Selam, can I come to you now? You represent the multilateral effort behind this. We seem to have lots to talk about, but we have no place to discuss it in. We've seen the postponement of the Glasgow meeting. What does this mean for multilateral discussion and dialogue?
Yeah, that's a very timely question, particularly taking into account that some think that even the COPs are not delivering on their mandate. That question is there, but not having it at all would also has a significant challenge. And particularly this year, COP26 was very important in achieving the remaining or agreeing on the remaining rules for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So maybe to provide some context, the Paris Agreement was agreed in 2015. Countries have been elaborating the rules of how they will be implementing their climate action. And those rules to some extent have been adopted at COP24, but there are also outstanding issues that need to be considered. In particular, the climate financing to developing countries. So the discussion and the process of this would inform the preparation of national policies of developing countries. So that discussion is now postponed. The other important issue is the market mechanisms of the Paris Agreement. This discussion could not be concluded at COP25 and was agreed that it will be concluded in December 2020. But the challenge with the postponement is now countries that have indicated their interest in using the market mechanisms for the implementation of their contributions starting 2021 will not have rules. So this is another significant challenge that will also delay to some extent the implementation of the Paris Agreement. In addition to that, this year, again, it was important because countries were expected to revise the overall contributions, defining their sectors on how they will be reducing their emission and submitting that to the UNFCCC and to the world to show that countries are still committed for addressing climate change and will take on this challenge. But that is now to some extent delayed with other priorities. So the political momentum that was needed to be there is now to some extent delayed. It will happen, but it's delayed. So this is going to be significant in actual implementation of the Paris Agreement starting in 2021.
Melanie, can I come back to you? Because we've heard a lot of doom and gloom in terms of what the future may hold, but can we focus on some opportunities? We've heard lots of discussion about cleaner air, cleaner and healthier flora and fauna. Tell us about some opportunities, particularly in the area of climate justice.
I think you're absolutely right that empirically it is true that reduced human movement, reduced traffic, reduced consumption have brought back air quality in cities like New Delhi and have allowed ecosystem regeneration in certain parts of the world. But looking ahead, I do want to warn against two dangers in light of this kind of narrative. And sorry to kind of put a little bit more of doom and gloom back into this, but I think we have to kind of look at the whole picture here. The first is a risk in a kind of return to Malthusian thinking that paints human population one-dimensionally as the villain. It's a kind of pessimistic and dark view that gave rise to Hardin's misplaced tragedy of the commons thesis and an unholy alliance between eugenicists, coercive population control measures, anti-immigration lobbies, and big greens. The environment and climate justice movements have had to challenge big greens for decades for being kind of too consumed with ecological protection at the expense of human rights and equity. So I hope those gains won't be undone. I agree that it does seem rosy in seeing some of these nice pictures of regenerated ecosystems and clean air in Delhi compared to the smog from 3 months ago. But I just hope that the gains that we've achieved in some of these more justice-oriented movements won't be undone in the months to come. The second thing I want to guard against is while my colleagues on this panel have rightly pointed out that there are opportunities for green investments and Green New Deal investments in green energy, this narrative that sort of pits humans against the environment can unwittingly be trumped by a kind of alarmism, an alarmism that insists that one must win out against the other. So even though it's true that there has been a push for Green New Deal types of measures, it's equally true that fracking companies and coal companies are pushing for securing massive bailouts, for instance, in the US, in light of the economic downturn through junk bonds. And so I think we have to be careful about the alarmism that can rise when you sort of pit humans against the environment. And we have to not undo the gains that were done by the climate justice and environmental justice agenda that really sees the two existing together. So a bit of optimism and pessimism thrown in there, I suppose, Anne.
Thank you very much. Caroline Kuzemko, what has happened to energy emissions during this pandemic? We've noticed that fossil fuel prices have fallen sharply. Does that have ramifications for sustainable energy transitions?
Okay, so now I'm going to be the one who tries to talk a little bit more optimistically, because, you know, clearly if you've been researching climate change for a long time, you can end up being in a position where you're pretty depressed. And there's lots that we can point at which is still pretty depressing. But on the optimistic side, in relation to where we sit today, the International Energy Agency's estimations are that emissions fell globally by 5% in the first quarter of this year versus last year. Their expectations are that they will fall by at least 8% in 2020 versus 2019, which would take us back to roughly the levels of 10 years ago. Now, if we kind of peel back the layers to find out why that is, it's obviously not just because economies are shrinking, but it's because, I think as Malini was talking a little bit about earlier, social practices have been having to change in response to lockdown and social distancing measures. And there's a duration question here that is quite interesting in relation to social practices, because the longer we have to change our practices, the more likely it is that some of those changes remain in place, with therefore impacts on downward pressure on emissions. But as Simon mentioned earlier, emissions are also falling because although we see a demand for coal, for oil, for gas, and prices, particularly for oil, collapsing, demand has not fallen for renewables. So they now provide a very small but relatively greater than expected share of energy. And then wanting to come back a little bit to pessimism, obviously there's no room for complacency, because even where we are today with what's happening to emissions, we're not on track to meet 1.5 Paris target. There's a lot of work to do on climate justice, again, as Malini has been talking about. But lastly, if you look at all those reports about what's going to happen to GDP growth and emissions, most of them are looking for a global rebound in GDP growth next year. And whether or not that leads to large emissions rebounds is really up to political decisions that are going to be taken in the next 6 months.
Thank you. Jatin Nathwani, what do you feel are the key barriers to reducing fossil fuel emissions?
The scale of change required is absolutely massive, the urgency even more so. So what's the problem? The problem is that fossil fuels are cheap, ostensibly cheap, and I'll clarify in a moment. But fossil fuels are so deeply embedded in the global economic output in a way that it's almost immovable barrier, or it might appear to be so. To get from that 85% to the 50% share may seem a gargantuan task. So when I say ostensibly cheap, what do I mean? There are two important factors that we tend to ignore or not taken into account. The massive subsidies to the fossil fuel sector. The IMF report indicating anywhere in the order of $400 to $500 billion per year. Entirely unacknowledged, no one knows about it because it's every country across the different spectrum where those subsidies show up to make fossil fuels ostensibly cheap. Number two, the externality is not really properly taken into account in terms of what it does. So if you do not take externality into account, the social cost of carbon in a very meaningful, dynamic, business-oriented way, you'll always come up with an answer which says fossil fuels are cheaper than everything else and all the other options look second best. And that is a fundamental barrier.
Thank you. Selam, any comments on the barriers to financing this, especially at the multilateral level?
Again, especially this year, the multilateral process, in particular to the UNFCCC, which is a legally binding treaty, there was a clear obligation on the pre-2020 global finance structure. This is particularly important in regards to climate justice and equity. There was a decision that provided that developed countries should provide climate finance to developing countries, a total of 100 billion every year by 2020. So this year, 2020, was a significant year in assessing that progress and also assessing if that's adequate and meeting the Paris targets and in supporting developing countries in making sure we are all under the Paris Agreement meeting that target. But now with priorities being diverted to some extent, that's still in question. And this will impact developing countries furthermore, and it will have a ripple effect on developing countries because their ability to implement their climate action on mitigation, adaptation is now more impacted by this. So there should be a consideration of what is the implication of this and how would it implicate, especially in developing countries, what would be its impact? Because even developing countries are now prioritizing the current crisis. So there has to be a consideration of how do we assess this, the adequacy, and maybe some kind of discussion on the way forward, in particular to climate justice and equity, because this was a decision to address that.
Thank you. Simon Dalby, any opportunities COVID throws up?
Well, just to extend this conversation, I think that it does throw opportunities in terms of the stimulus fund, where it is that the money gets directed. To Selam's point, what's extraordinary is the contrast between the amount of money that is suddenly available to be thrown into stimulus funding in contrast to the stingy amount that is being donated to international efforts for green development and climate adaptation. Trying to get a few billion here and a few billion there out of northern governments has been incredibly difficult, but suddenly there's trillions available to deal with COVID. And I think the politics of this is really clear. Who gets to get the money is tied into the heart of the whole climate change discussion. And it's suddenly become clear that these decisions are political ones, not technical ones. And I think that has changed a lot in even the last couple of months. One of the other things that has been fascinating to watch over the last few months has been how people at the heart of the financial sector have suddenly, it seems, woken up to, oh, wait a minute, we actually have some real liabilities and risks from climate damage. Kinsey and Company, Larry Fink, all sorts of people at the heart of the financial industry have over the last few months been saying, wait a minute, there are stranded assets dangers, there are all sorts of problems with supply chains. And of course, the disruption of COVID has made this point very, very clear to people that hadn't figured it out by now, that the global supply chains are also vulnerable to disruptions from climate and from disasters in the same way as they are from the social and economic measures taken to try to deal with COVID. So, you know, you look at the development banks in the European Union in the last little while had already, prior to COVID, announced that they were phasing out investments in coal and various other fossil fuel things. So in fact, there was a momentum beginning to happen in the right direction on all of these things, which if policymakers can act quickly and get it right, those developments can be pushed dramatically forward in the coming months. But to Malini's point, it will be a major step back if the fracking companies and the fossil fuel companies get part of the stimulus package largesse, as I feel will happen particularly in the United States. And so there's a straight political fight on here as to where the money goes, and the consequences down the road are huge. And we need to focus on any policymaker that is paying attention to this needs to understand the consequences of this crucial moment in terms of where those stimulus fundings actually go. And hopefully somewhere in the middle of all of this, some of those green development funds and some of the climate adaptation programs will get a little bit of this money too, precisely because the global south is going to need every bit of investment on these things that it can get. Doing that in a way that adds in the social justice dimension, I think, is crucially important. And you know, your summer reading should definitely be Kate Raworth's book on donut economics, where it looks at the necessity of investment that takes ecological limits and social consequences as part of the policy picture. And that, I think, is you know, that kind of book is now beginning to become part of the mainstream discussion, and we need to push those ideas long and hard over the next few months.
Thank you. Caroline, emissions fell during the last large-scale global crisis in 2008, but then rebounded quickly afterwards. Do you think we might see a similar trend after we get through the economic aftermath of the COVID crisis?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think it's like the $6 million question of the moment, really, isn't it? And I suppose coming back to what quite a lot of us have said so far today is that it really will depend on how governments respond. But there's a lot of nuance here because responses will be varied between countries, and actually, if you look at the United States, within countries as well. Just as there are differences in support for climate change, you know, within and between countries. So we've already seen bailouts, for example, in the United States for fossil fuel companies with no conditions attached, whilst in other places we've seen bailouts with very specific decarbonisation targets attached, for example, the Air France bailout. And sort of a big question that sits underneath this is how economically and politically important fossil fuels are within each of those different economies. But then this is a little bit more multi-scalar than it used to be. So as I was pointing towards the United States and the differences within countries, subnationally, we're seeing very high profile states and cities making changes to support more cycling and walking, and thereby structurally trying to reinforce the practice changes that we're seeing in transport. So there's a lot of cities doing it, but a lot of them are big, large, global, London, Seattle, Milan, Mexico City, sort of in lots of places in the world. And so I think that's quite an important difference between now and 2008. And another one is that in some OECD countries, actually renewables are cost competitive with fossil fuels for electricity production. So that's kind of quite a big change. And then lastly, picking up on some of the things Simon was saying in relation to finance, there's far more recognition now of the risks associated with stranded assets for fossil fuel companies. There's been large-scale investment actors committing to divesting away from fossil fuels prior to the crisis, which I don't think many people had expected. And estimates are now starting to emerge within the crisis about peak demand for oil maybe coming closer as a result of some of the demand destruction within the crisis. So it's an interesting, different moment in time.
Definitely. Jatin Nathwani, might COVID effectively denude the global financial capacity to address climate change?
That is my fear. I do remain optimistic still that, and to pick up on points that Simon and Caroline have made, Caroline, we may see 8% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions this year, according to IEA estimates. But that needs to be so for every other year from now on till 2050 to make any substantive change. Point that Simon makes, I think, is a real cause for hope. I'll frame it. The IEA estimates of the sustainable development scenario requires an investment of $69 trillion over 20 years. So $3 trillion a year, let's say, is not all that huge an amount of money. But where might this come from? We see the ESG mandates, and we see, climate-related corporate liability, first led by the Bank of England and other central bankers, and now has taken full hold in terms of how boards make decisions on investments, and are you subject or not subject to liability on climate risk. And I think that will shift the focus in a substantial enough way. In essence, what I say is follow the money, and where the risks are fully integrated and recognized, the notion of even environmental liability externality will come into play, and that will shift the picture more than any $100 billion fund around which we're going to argue about who puts what in and who takes what out and so on. The scale is substantially larger, but those are two positive things I believe will shift the direction.
Thank you very much. Malini, I want to come to you because there's lots of questions coming in from the audience about the rise of the expert and scientific research being the renewed faith in it coming by way of the COVID crisis. What research areas do you think need some focus now to keep the momentum going?
Yes, well, I'll immediately start with a question that I think Simon, Jatin, and Caroline have all spoken to, a very pressing question, which is how are government relief and bailout monies being spent, right? Particularly, I would love to see divvying up of bailout monies being spent on sectors that perpetuate a carbon-based economy versus those that reduce carbon intensity. That would be an interesting research question to try to do, at different scales for different parts of the world. The second question gets back to some of the topics I was talking about earlier on environmental justice, which is that we know that COVID-19 is being experienced differently by zip code and geography, rural and urban densities, class, race, and age, for instance. But apart from continuing to gather more granular data on these differences, what are the opportunities for addressing both COVID-19 inequalities as well as building climate resilience through, for instance, interagency coordination, both at the global scale as well as more granular scale, for instance, through grassroots mutual aid initiatives, right? So are there ways to address both together? And it's not by any means obvious that they always can be addressed together, but are there ways that we can think of innovatively for them to be addressed together? And finally, something that I've been really thinking about hearing news coming out of South Asia is what is the relationship between climate-related migration and global health? In India, we're hearing these very alarming stories of rural migrants who come to cities in India because of labor opportunities, of course, but they're also pushed because of climate-induced drought and agrarian distress, something that P. Sainath, the journalist, has been reporting about for several years. And then once they come to cities, they're now at the receiving end of punitive government actions vis-a-vis COVID-19 and a lack of protection against infection. So what is the relationship between migration, health, climate-induced migration and health is a third area I can think of, but certainly there are many more.
We've got a lot of questions coming in on the increased use of household appliances during this time, and arguably the decreased use of office energy demands. Simon, can I come back to you for any commentary on that dichotomy and what this means for cleaner behavior going forward?
We're working from home. I'm sitting in my house talking to you now, not in my office down the street at the school. The question then becomes, well, is actually my house more efficient and more energy efficient than the school is? And of course, one of the things that is crucial to the whole stimulus package dealing with energy is going to have to be thinking seriously about dramatically improving efficiencies of buildings. Now, our Balsillie school building is fairly new and reasonably efficient, but there's an awful lot of old buildings that were never designed with energy efficiency in mind. Now, if everybody's gone home to efficient energy sensible houses and they're closing down those big office buildings, maybe we're getting ahead. And it really does depend on which buildings where are designed to take climate and energy issues seriously. And if it allows us in the process of adapting to this to close down some of the really old, inefficient buildings, maybe we're going to end up getting ahead. It also, of course, dramatically reduces the amount of energy used in commuting. Although that said, those of us who bike or walk to work, it doesn't change that much. So the traffic patterns in cities are the other part of this that I think is really important. And we need to stop and think seriously about rewiring and reorganizing our transportation systems. London, and if somebody mentioned Seattle earlier, in terms of actually turning streets over to pedestrians. And frankly, the humble bicycle is something that we need to think about integrating, as they do in particularly Copenhagen and some of the Dutch cities as well. There's a wonderful innovation in that part of the world in terms of bike paths, coupled, of course, with the introduction of all sorts of new energy assist type bicycles. That is changing the possibilities for commuting too. And it's all of these kinds of things that we need to think through systematically. It's not one or the other, it's how you put all these pieces together is what's absolutely crucial to the policy response. And we are going to have to do a whole lot of city planning. We're also going to have to think about which buildings do we retrofit. Building standards for new buildings are simply going to have to follow passive house standards, for instance, that mean you don't actually have furnaces in houses. We've got to do the same thing with office buildings, and we probably actually need quite a lot less office buildings if more of us are actually working from home. But there are, of course, all the social justice issues in terms of availability of bandwidth. You know, I can afford an iPad, but there's an awful lot of people that should ideally perhaps be telecommuting who can't, and also don't have the luxury of having a room where they can close the door and keep the rest of the family out. There's all of those things have to be thought through in terms of the responses as we go forward.
Thanks very much. I'm going to come to Jatin because I know you've written a lot on Alberta here in Canada at the moment, but there's a lot of other similar global areas like Alberta with rich natural resource bases. Would the Canadian government assisting Alberta to transition to the production and use of hydrogen make technological and economic sense to you?
Yeah, I have been adamant in the bits that I have written that when it comes to bailout, that the oil sector should not be recipients of any bailouts. But this is not in a mean-spirited way. What I'm really trying to get at is that this is an opportunity where, in fact, for that matter, the oil and gas sector can pivot to, and I point out the example of geothermal energy as one completely something that fits in, because that sector has in-depth capacity to, they know how to dig a hole. And the question is not to take carbon out, but to take heat out. And the promotion of geothermal energy is for baseload generation, for heat. It's carbon-free energy. It's ubiquitous. There actually is a geothermal sector, energy sector in Alberta. They don't get the time of day in front of the oil and gas companies, and they have their businesses in Indonesia and Chile and somewhere else. So that's a perfect spot where you can use existing capacity of that industry and an enormously innovative capacity of that industry to turn the gaze to say, why don't we do something different? The sector spends $50 billion a year in capital investments, 45, 50 a year. I would say even a $5 billion commitment and leverage with $5 billion of federal government loan guarantee or something, you create a $10 billion geothermal energy, and you will change the picture in 10 or 15 years from now to something very different. And that is a wonderful opportunity. I could go on many other examples, but that's one. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Many questions also coming in on what kind of climate disaster we may be heading towards in the global dimension of the current pandemic. So any views, Malini, I'm going to start with you on what form it might take and what possible impact it might have.
So could you repeat the question from the audience, please?
What, if any, we could expect in the form of the next big climate disaster of a global dimension, and what impact might it have?
Yes, I woke up this morning thinking about how wildfire season is going to ignite again this summer. It was very, very bad last summer. Not just in the western parts of the United States, but also in Australia, also in parts of Europe. And so I woke up this morning thinking, if people have to leave their homes and you know, to flee the fire, where would they go in a way that wouldn't violate social distancing norms? And so for me, getting people out of their homes to safety is so important in the face of a climate emergency, but how does that reconcile with social distancing? So that's what I'm thinking of, that's on my mind right now, but there are other climate-induced disasters that we are likely to see this summer as well.
Selam, can I ask you, you're part of the dialogue going on across the African continent. What sort of climate-related disasters are being fought through there?
I mean, particularly on adaptation, a key component was the efforts of countries in their efforts to reduce the emission itself, because adaptation and disaster risk under the Paris Agreement is linked. The most mitigation we do, the less adaptation countries have to implement. But currently African countries are investing to 29% of their GDP to address the adaptation of the impacts of climate change. So if this year, as we've been saying, the economic revival package is not linked to actually achieving and reducing emissions. And there has been now encouragement where individuals going to work should use their cars rather than public transport systems, which is really concerning. And if people are going out and buying old cars, then that has also a significant challenge. Maybe such economic revivals could be linked to energy efficient transportation systems, energy efficient cars, people if they have to drive to achieve the social distancing. If they consider this and we limit the emission to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, then we will be in a position to reduce the impacts and the disasters, especially in developing countries. And also the capacity of developing countries is linked to the support they'll be receiving. As we've been saying, and as Simon rightly indicated, that has been only a stretch under the UNFCCC process. But now even that is going to be shifted, because countries are already, developed countries themselves are already in crisis, and they need to address the crisis of COVID-19. So these things make me worry about the challenge. Yeah.
Caroline, can I come to you, because there are many questions about citizen support for more energy and climate change funding, especially after the introduction of the Pelosi bill in Washington and other efforts that show really not much momentum towards funding on this agenda, yet a lot of COVID-related funding. So any comments from you?
I think that this is a moment in time where there is a lot more reflection, and it's happened at a moment in time where in a lot of countries in the world, support for climate change from the publics and engagement in and participation in communities related to climate change had been growing. So we have Extinction Rebellion, we have the Youth Climate Movement. There's a lot more momentum than there has been before. And I think that some of the lessons that we're learning from this crisis about the consequences of not taking action when warned about potential humanitarian crises, the lessons we're learning about the connections between human activities and our ecosystems, they're all being really brought to the fore and made much, much more visible. And I think that, like we see, you've been pointing to a US example, but here in Europe, we're seeing polls coming in, big opinion polls, showing that publics now expect their policymakers to value health and well-being more than GDP. And so we've come from a time when the political message of "it's the economy, stupid" has been incredibly successful. And I just wonder if what you've just mentioned there and the sorts of things that we're seeing over here mean that our policy makers will be now required to refocus a little bit on other values, including obviously transformations that are environmentally and socially sustainable.
Thank you very much. And speaking about policymakers, we have many in the audience at the moment. So I'd like to take the last few minutes to turn to each of you for a quick 30-second burst on what considerations and messages you would direct to the policy community at this time. Jatin Nathwani.
If low carbon is where you want to go, legally mandated exits are the most promising. I'll give you two simple examples. Ontario, we managed to get out of coal without a carbon tax, without a carbon trade regime, and we're out, done. Germany is a perfect recent example of exit from coal. 2 decades they wasted with feed-in tariffs and whatever else. And now with no impacts on carbon footprint, now they'll be out of carbon by 2035 with coal, and that's illegally mandated. But they achieved it in a politically consistent manner with all stakeholders involved, and done.
Thank you. Simon Dalby, key messages for the policy community.
Just to follow on from Jatin's point, don't put money into anything that burns stuff. Fossil fuels are all about combustion. If you're going to get serious about stimulus funding, don't put it into stuff that is going to involve further combustion, because this is quite clearly something we need to phase out and as rapidly as possible while rebuilding our economies based on new energy systems. That has to be the priority in the immediate future, and then we have to stick with it.
Thank you very much. Salam, key messages for the policy community, multilateral and national.
Yeah, again, echoing what has been said, I agree that policies and national frameworks are important for achieving this, but the global response is also a collective response, and that informs the national processes. So I believe that should be considered, and we need to work around that. And we can also learn from a new cooperation models. We have seen that due to this crisis, a new cooperation has been implemented. Doctors are moving beyond borders without the restrictions that they used to have before checking the credentials and so on. So that's a new way of cooperation. The second, the expedited process of approving new technology products. So that is something that maybe the global response can take lessons learned and also maybe share that similarly to address climate emergency.
Thank you. Malini, any views from you? What can you share with policymakers?
So echoing Simon and Jatin, I think that business as usual, that is large corporate bailouts for the fossil fuel industry, favors for extractive industries, subsidies, these cannot be the answer here. Let us not tread along this well-worn, ultimately self-defeating path again, and let us instead invest in disinvested communities, health equity, green jobs, and bottom-up climate resilience. Second, what is the future of work? And how are we going to frame this? Essential workers such as sanitation and trash workers, migrant laborers, postal workers, grocery clerks, farm workers, childcare workers, these are not people who do low-skilled jobs. These are jobs that we must valorize and strengthen safety nets for in a greener economy. And finally, let us use this opportunity to think about health, environmental, and social justice together.
Great, thank you very much. A quick 15-second burst, Caroline, if you can.
Okay, so 15 seconds. I agree with all of the above, but I think that we should also use this opportunity to think about how we phase out the old and the consequences of doing that. And if you look at the EU Green Deal, it has a just transition fund in it, and that's all about how you reskill fossil fuel workers and get them into new jobs.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to the audience for such great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. There were many. We'll try our best, if you leave your email details, to get back to you individually. Thank you for what I thought was an interesting, compelling, and highly timely discussion. Please tune in with us next week, same time, same place, same link, for an equally interesting discussion on COVID-19 and the implications for migration flows and refugees. Until then, take care and stay safe.